Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, in terms of today, what I want to do is I want to highlight some really important parts of the story of German unification. So how the German nation comes into being when it does in the 1860s and early 1870s. And of course, I did give you guys, accompanying this screencast recording, also an article to read on the subject. That article I felt is a really nice, easy to read kind of blanket overview. But what I want to do in here is to kind of clarify some of the content of that article a little bit more in detail, add a little bit of depth of understanding so that hopefully you feel very confident in what transpired during this super influential decade. Now, contextually, to kind of set the scene here, one thing that we need to all kind of understand is the situation in Central Europe coming out of the Napoleonic Wars. If you remember in previous lessons and units, we had highlighted how the norm in Central Europe for literally 1,000 years up to this juncture was that you had always had the Holy Roman Empire, right? You always had that loose confederation of hundreds upon hundreds of smaller German states, and that you just had complete and total political fragmentation. You had no real sense of national unity or a large, strong state whatsoever. Well, after Napoleon overruns much of Europe and then is defeated, the Allied powers at the Congress of Vienna decide that they are not going to bring back the Holy Roman Empire. That thing is dead. That somebody's put a stake through its heart. It's not being resurrected. But what they do decide to create in its place, which is kind of like Holy Roman Empire light, is something called the German Confederation. And the German Confederation was meant to just be this kind of loose economic alliance of 39 German-speaking countries. So again, when we think about this big picture, it wasn't that long ago that we had hundreds of German-speaking countries. Now we're down to 39. So we have seen a drastic amount of political consolidation, especially in the centuries following the 30 Years' War. So it's been gradual, it's been pronounced. Now we're down to the 39 last survivors. Well, out of those 39, the two most powerful, important countries that were members of the German Confederation was Prussia and Austria. And they were both, German speakers. One thing that a lot of people always forget about is that Austrians are ethnic Germans. Okay, so at this time, the Austrian Habsburgs, they're German people the same way as people in Prussia are ethnically German people. And both of those states were put into the German Confederation to hopefully kind of counterbalance and hold each other in check. Remember, the goals of Vienna was to create this lasting balance of power to promote general peace. So you had powerful Prussia, you had powerful Austria, you had 37 of their closest friends. And I always say that when you look at kind of the trajectories that Prussia and Austria were moving in at this point in history, they were basically complete and total polar opposites. Austria had really reached its peak of military, economic, political clout like in the early 1600s. And since then, while it had grown territorially, it had kind of fallen farther behind a lot of its Western European counterparts. Whereas, Prussia had pretty much been on a gradual ascent since the 30 Years' War. We had highlighted how they institute their military reserve system and the reforms of, people like Frederick the Great or Frederick the Great Elector, prior to him, or William Frederick, excuse me. So, they had been slowly but surely gaining territory, and also with that gaining a reputation as being one of the top dogs militarily in Europe at this point. Well, it's in this context that we see really kind of a growing sense then of German nationalism. In the 1830s, 1840s, many Germans felt that, hey, we're going to continue to get kind of conquered and bullied by more powerful neighbors unless we all band together. And that if we can band together and if all Germans come together, well, we will be a force to be reckoned with. Now, in addition to just that kind of desire amongst many people in the population and many political leaders, you also had the economic realities that were coming to play. I mean, you think about it from the perspective of as a buyer or a businessman. If you have 39 small countries and you want to buy, a product that is, produced in the south of the German Confederation and you're purchasing it in the north of the German Confederation, the amount of times that product is going to have to pass through different countries, the number of times that merchants are going to have to pay tolls and tariffs, the amount of markups there are going to be financially is going to be vast. So this political cartoon from the era just is kind of poking fun, at just the economic inefficiencies of the German Confederation. And how a lot of people, maybe could have cared less about nationalism and maybe could have cared less about military clout, but they cared a lot about buying and selling. They cared a lot about stuff that impacted, average everyday households in their pocketbooks. Well, it's in this context then that the guy who really is kind of the power behind the German unification movement ascends the throne. And that is the king or the Kaiser of Prussia, a member of that same Hohenzollern royal family that had ruled that country for centuries, a man by the name of Wilhelm the First. Now, Wilhelm the First, in addition to just being a pioneer of growing out glorious mutton chops. I mean, every time that I look at this picture, I'm always like, well, what was the goal of this? Like, what, did he think it was sexy? Did he think he was like really good looking? Did he fashion this so that he could eat soup out of a bowl without soaking his beard? Like, what was the game plan behind his facial hair here? But in addition to that, Wilhelm was somebody who was determined. He was highly militaristically inclined. He felt that, hey, we got this army, we should use it. He was very expansionistic in terms of his kind of foreign policy goals. He wanted to gobble up his neighbors. He wanted to enlarge itself. But he was also somebody that was very wise in terms of delegating authority. He knew his own personal limits. He knew that it was important to put, really brilliant, smart, cunning people in positions of power. And this is a really remarkable contrast compared to his son, Wilhelm II, who was then the World War I guy. And Wilhelm II, anybody that you ever read the biographies about Wilhelm II or some books about, the leading up to the World War I mean, basically Wilhelm II was a guy who liked to play war, but the guy was basically a buffoon. I mean, the guy was an incompetent statesman. The guy, you could argue that a lot of his decisions directly led, Europe into that kind of apocalypse. So Wilhelm I, though, brilliant guy who is going to, in essence, oversee unification. He's going to be given the green light to his subordinates to pursue that ultimate goal. And eventually he will become the first king or Kaiser or emperor, or whatever title you want to give him, of a united German state in 1871. Now, when I say that he delegated effectively, as your reading highlighted, the guy that he ends up hiring, the guy that he basically tabs as the person to run Prussia on a day-to-day basis, the person that's going to serve as his prime minister from 1862 onwards, is the man that you see in this portrait, Mr. Otto von Bismarck. And Bismarck, is to German unification what Cavour is to Italian unification. He's not a battlefield commander. He's not a general. He's a diplomat. And he's a brilliant and cunning and ruthless diplomat. In fact, many people oftentimes make the analogy that he's like the Machiavelli of his day. So if you forget that name Machiavelli, or if it rings a bell and you're like, wait a minute, I think we learned about him at some point, but I don't recall. Remember, Machiavelli was that writer back during the Renaissance in the 1500s who wrote The Prince, this guide about how political rulers should behave, and a lot of what like Machiavelli suggested was that basically, a political ruler should do whatever is necessary to further their goals, good, bad, or otherwise. So oftentimes when somebody is described as being Machiavellian, they're described as being cunning and devious and underhanded in pursuit of their goals or end aims. Well, that's Bismarck in a nutshell. Now, Bismarck, his kind of game plan then to pursue territorial expansion and most notably German unification was he understood the power of foreign wars. He understood the power of trying to create a situation where it's us versus them. It's us Germans versus them foreigners. Let's all work together as one people, with the hope that, hey, if we all work together, that coming together is going to kind of stick and that it's going to permanently fuse us. Well, it's along these lines that in 1864, Bismarck conjures up a war. And this is what he does 3 times. He basically creates wars where there shouldn't have been wars. He devises the conditions for conflict. He inflames the situation on purpose because he knows there's a good chance that Prussia is going to come out of that war victorious, and that Prussia then, as a result, is going to benefit, long term. So the first war that he basically creates is a war with little old Denmark. Yes, this small neighboring country to the north here. Even today, Denmark is a super small country territorially and population-wise. I think I've told you before, I've spent, well over a month and a half of my life, living and traveling around Denmark. And even today, its population is only like 5 or 6 million people. So we are talking a super small kind of peripheral player in European affairs here. Well, how he conjures up kind of a conflict, especially a nationalistic conflict, was specifically over some border territories shown here on this map called Schleswig and Holstein. Yeah, so say that 5 times fast. Schleswig, Holstein. You got to get like the right amount of added into there for inflection's sake. Schleswig and Holstein, were 2 territories that were of mixed Danish and German population. So you had, an equal amount of German speakers, equal amount of Danish speakers. And these were territories that had recently come under the control of the Danish king through marriage and inheritance. Okay, so the King of Denmark is now also the Duke of Holstein, but that ownership was basically brand new. And the plan, of course, of the Danish king was that he was planning on just formally annexing them into a state. They border up against, it's all contiguous, might as well just add them to Denmark permanently. Well, this was something that, of course, didn't go over well with a lot of the Germans living in those territories. A lot of Germans didn't want to be part of the Danish state. Again, this is a time of German nationalism. And so you do start to see some level of like small scale fighting and military organizing within those territories. But it was very minor and it was very isolated. Well, Bismarck hears about this, and he takes this topic before kind of like the National Assembly of the German Confederation. So this big meeting of all these, German states. And he gives this passion speech where he talks about the fact that, the evil Danes, were oppressing the German peoples, of Schleswig and Holstein, and that any true German, needed to step forward and protect and defend their, ethnic German brethren. And he calls on the German Confederation basically to go to war to free their brothers and sisters. Well, the speech works. The entire German Confederation then votes to declare war on Denmark. And so you literally get then on paper one of the most probably lopsided conflicts in all of world history. 39 German countries, including Austria and Prussia, versus little old Denmark. And of course, the war is a cakewalk. The war lasts like all of like 3.5 days. It's like over before it barely begins. This would be like, all of you guys, banding together and saying, hey, we're going to walk over to like, Rogers, elementary and just like go punch some like random fifth grader in the face. Like, it would not be a fair fight. Now, at the end of the war, part of the terms of the agreement was that these disputed territories would then pass into German hands, that it would pass to the German Confederation. The German Confederation would decide what would happen to these territories. And specifically, what they then voted on was that Schleswig would then be given to Austria. So that would become a possession of the Austrian Habsburgs, and Holstein would become a possession of Prussia and would be occupied by Prussia. The other really important thing, that basically this war does, though, is it really sets forward Prussia as the leader of the German people. Prussia led the war effort. Prussia was the one that spoke out in the first place. So Prussia starts to be just kind of automatically recognized as the leader in the minds of most German people by this point. Hey, they're not doing this for nefarious reasons. They're doing this for all of our good. We should follow Prussia's lead. And even by this point, there are some, rulers of other German states that are saying, you know what, maybe we should unify. Maybe I should give up power and we should become part of Prussia. So that discussion is all kind of starting. Now, the important kind of other thing, though, about this first war, this Danish-German war, is that it's then the ownership of Schleswig and Holstein that Bismarck then uses to set up the second major war of unification here. And that is that he picks a fight with Austria. Because not only is his goal to kind of rally, the German people around Prussian leadership, he's also trying to do that at the same time that he's trying to push Austria out of the way. Let's get them out of here. They're not part of this. They're our rival. We need to get them out of the picture altogether. So one way you can kind of think of the first war is that the first war is just a really essential first step for setting up the second war, which has greater tangible outcomes. Now, specifically what Bismarck then does, so first war ends, everybody's high-fiving everybody, yeah, we're all on the same team, yeah, Austria, yeah, Prussia. And then almost immediately, the Austrians go to occupy their newly won territory, and they find that the Prussians will not allow them access. And they're like, wait a minute, no, but we were friends, remember? Like, we just won that war together. Like, we're trying to go up to Schleswig there, and, it's ours. You said so. And the Prussians are basically like, listen, it's yours, but we didn't say that you could go through our territory to get there. And they just kind of like play this game that is purposely meant to drive up tensions. At the same time, the Prussian delegation to the Assembly of the German Confederation brings forward a bunch of resolutions, basically saying like, hey, from this point forward, Prussia should have like the sole leadership position and blah, 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 blah. And Austria feeling like, hey, things are moving way too fast here. Hold up, they're screwing with us. Something's going on. Ultimately, by 1866, decides to declare war. Now, of course, this plays in perfectly to Bismarck's plot because it's then Austria that's the aggressor. It's not peaceful Prussia that started this war. We're not the ones declaring on anybody. It's Austria that's declaring war, in part because they had been baited into it by the stuff over Schleswig and Holstein. Now, in this war, which then becomes known as the 7 Weeks War because it lasts all of a whopping 7 weeks, pretty much the German Confederation then is forced to pick sides. It's almost like there's a line drawn in the sand. It's like, all right, you're either with Austria or you're with Prussia, one or the other, pick sides. And what we see is that basically the other German states pick sides based on geographic location. So basically the North Germans go with Prussia, the South Germans go with Austria, but they also kind of align religiously, because the North traditionally was Protestant, the South traditionally was Catholic, the Austrians are traditionally Catholic, the Prussians are traditionally Lutheran. And so you also had that kind of religious cultural dynamic there as well. Now, why this conflict ends up being such a cakewalk for the North Germans, because it was, 7 weeks, it's over, it's a decisive Prussian victory, is in part because of two things. A, Prussia was probably the other country, the second country behind Great Britain in terms of pace of industrialization in Europe at this point. We're talking developing factories, laying rail lines. So not only did they have economic production, way in advance compared to Austria, where they could produce more, produce stuff of uniform, high quality, the Austrians could not, but they also had the shipping where they could move the men to the front lines. They could resupply them easily. And I put up here this, map that shows rail lines in 1880, which is obviously, 14 years later, but still it speaks to how expansive their investment in these new technologies were. The other really huge new technology that the Prussians had adopted universally by 1866 that the Austrians hadn't adopted whatsoever was a new military innovation, something called the Dreiss needle gun. And the Dreiss needle gun was basically the standard equipment in the Prussian army in 1866. What it was is it was a bolt action rifle. It's one of the world's first bolt action rifles, but it was the first that was universally adopted by a nation's armed forces. If you know anything about world military history at this juncture in general, I mean, you figure 1866, right after the American Civil War. So in the American Civil War, vast overwhelming majority of soldiers were using muzzle loaders still. Right, you have to rip off the top of the cartridge and pour the gunpowder and the musket ball down the barrel and ram that thing down and get your percussion cap and then fire and then do the same thing. And it might take you 30 seconds, 45 seconds or so to reload and fire each time. Well, by the end of the American Civil War, especially the North had started to adopt and started to issue some level of repeating rifles, where instead of, putting in the muzzle and doing that whole process, instead you had a breech loader where you had a single cartridge, a single metal bullet that you put in through the breech, you'd cock, and you'd fire. And then you repeat, put it in, cock, fire. Well, that's what the Dreiss needle gun was. It was a super accurate, very well made, universally issued bolt action rifle where instead of 45 seconds shoot, 45 seconds shoot, instead you have fire, fire, fire. It gives the Prussians such an incredible amount of superiority on the battlefield that, again, like the Danish War, it's almost over before it even begins. Now, in terms of the outcomes then of that 7 weeks war, what this does is that, first of all, it ends the German Confederation. Okay, so one of the terms of the peace treaty is that the German Confederation is no more. It's dissolved. In its place, then, it was agreed that they would create something called the North German Confederation. And what the North German Confederation basically was a military alliance of all of the states in northern Germany. So you see this like blue line here. So this outlines the new North German Confederation. And when I say a military alliance, basically think like a NATO. Okay, so you attack one country in the North German Confederation, all of the other nations within the North German Confederation then go to war against that aggressor country, and that all of their militaries are basically kind of incorporated, right? You don't have just American troops, you have NATO troops, and they're all using the same kind of bullets, and they're all using the same kind of guns, and they all have the same command structure. That's basically what you see with the North German Confederation in 1866. So this first major step toward true unification. It was also agreed at this point that a number of North German states would just agree to unify with Prussia, and that had to be acknowledged. The most notable being the state of Hanover, which was a really large, influential North German state in its own right. Well, that becomes part of Prussia. And so little by little, some of these ones in this kind of medium color you see here formally become part of the Prussian state. And then, of course, from this point forward, Austria, you're not part of the North German Confederation. So Austria is, from this point forward, is basically excluded from any and all German affairs. They are now out of the picture. You're your own thing. And that's why even today, Austria is still its own country despite being German, despite being culturally the same as their northern and western neighbors. Now, by this point, okay, at least half of the unification is done. And this has all been, you figure 1866, Bismarck only took the job in 1862. This all happens in 4 years. But Bismarck knew that he still needed one more major war, one more major war to get those Southern Catholic states into the fold. And I put up here, famous quote that Bismarck made, granted after the fact. So hindsight's always 50-50, but you see there, he wrote, "I did not doubt that a Franco-German war must first take place before the construction of a united Germany could be realized." So basically, hey, if we're going to get all Germans in on the game, if we truly want to unite us all into one state and one people, we're going to need to go after the enemy that we all hate and that we have all always hated. And that is, of course, France. Now, typically for, the past few hundred years, it had always been France that had been the aggressor on the German peoples, right? It had been Louis XIV that had invaded. It had been, the French that had invaded the Holy Roman Empire during the 30 Years' War. It had been, the French under the Revolution or under Napoleon that had been the expander or the aggressor. Now it's our chance to get even. And specifically, the kind of prize that was especially dangled in front of the faces of a lot of the Southern Germans is that, hey, if you help us out, if you help us out in this war against France, we're going to give you something that you guys have wanted for a very long time. We're going to get you back the Rhineland. We're going to get you back Alsace and Lorraine, those disputed territories that had changed hands in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. So that, it was a big, part of, why everything plays out the way that it does. Now, of course, all right, he wants a war with France. He knows that it's going to unify the country. Again, he just needs to create the situation. And the situation presents itself then in 1870 with something called the Ems Dispatch. Now, basically, the backstory of the Ems Dispatch, and again, I think the reading mentioned this just like very briefly, but not overly in detail, was that in 1870, you had another succession crisis in Spain. Yes, this is the second time that this has happened. If you remember back in 1700, you had the last Habsburg king of Spain who died, and it caused the War of Spanish Succession. Well, by 1870, you have another death of a Spanish king, no pinpointed heir. And so pretty much all of the different royal families in Europe were putting up members of their families as candidates. And there was a lot of discussion and debate going on and, in the halls of government throughout Europe, who are we all going to agree to? What's going to be the compromise decision? Who's going to rule Spain moving forward? Well, in part to peeve off the French more than anything else, Bismarck puts forward a lesser member of the Hohenzollern royal family. He basically nominates, some younger Hohenzollern prince to be the next king of Spain. And this enrages, the French government and the French people because they're like, wait a minute, we don't want Germans, on our one side and on the other side. We don't want to be encircled by German Hohenzollerns. So they were very, very against this. So it's in this context that the king, the Kaiser Wilhelm I, is on vacation at a German resort spa called Ems. Okay. And this is actually a picture of Wilhelm. You see him there rocking the top hat and the cane. And he's there, at this resort, and he's on vacation. He's just supposed to be there relaxing when he's basically, hounded one day by the French ambassador. The French ambassador finds out that he's there. He shows up at this resort. And so I believe that's a picture of him off to, my right, maybe your left. I don't know how you're seeing this, but off to his side, who comes up to him while he's out on his morning stroll and basically says to him, listen, My government wants to know what's the deal with this, nomination. Is this serious? Or are you going to really push for this? We would prefer that you renounce that candidacy. Maybe we can discuss this more, blah, 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 blah. So he's trying to get an answer out of Wilhelm. And Wilhelm basically turns to him and says, listen, dude, I'm on vacation. Leave me alone. Like, I'll call my secretary. We'll set up a meeting. We'll discuss it when I get back to Berlin. And he just kind of continues to walk off. Well, later on that night, as he's kind of dictating some things to his secretary, he says to his secretary, hey, send a quick, telegram back to Bismarck in Berlin. Just let him know what happened. Let him know that, the French are kind of pissed about this, whatever. So be it. And he sends off this message to Bismarck. Well, Bismarck gets the dispatch, the Ems dispatch, and he basically changes it. He just completely doctors it, fabricates it, rewrites it, turns it into a document that in no way, shape, or form reflects what really happened. And instead of it being this, message saying that, like, oh, we just had this meeting and they want to talk and we're going to, instead he made it out to sound like there was this like big confrontation. The king was on vacation and he was accosted by this angry, French minister who issued an ultimatum, and that the minister said that, if we don't renounce this candidacy, that would be the grounds for war and blah, 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 blah. And that, Wilhelm then turned around and basically, rudely, what's the word I'm looking for here? Insulted, the French minister and called him some names and disparaged. And it makes it out to be this like big dramatic thing. Well, Bismarck then takes this doctored version of events that never happened and gives it to the press and says, hey, look what just happened at Ems. You publish this in the paper. And of course, one newspaper publishes it, and then the next newspaper publishes it, and it gets picked up by other newspapers, across Europe and frankly throughout the world. And before you know it, all of these papers, all these news services are reporting this as fact, even though it never happened. And what this does is it greatly inflames anger and tensions in both Germany and in France. And it gets so heated that basically the French government comes and gives the Prussians an ultimatum that, hey, you either, says here that this happened and blah, 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 and you better apologize and you better renounce the candidacy or else. And Bismarck says, no, we're not doing that. And France declares war. Again, this is exactly what Bismarck wanted to happen. He was baiting them into a war. He was trying to make France look like the aggressor. Meanwhile, he's sitting there, with that fist cocked, ready to pounce. He's ready for war. He has all of his troops mobilized. He has all of his supplies and logistics ready to go. And so the second that France declares war, German troops, North German Confederation troops, Southern German troops, troops of all these independent states that are left, all come pouring into northern France via Prussian rail lines and under the command of Prussian generals, and invade and occupy everything that you see outlined here on this map. Very quickly, there's a major battle, most decisive battle in this war, which becomes known as the Franco-Prussian War, called the Battle of Sedan. And at Battle of Sedan, basically an entire French army gets surrounded in like this large fortress, and they're cut off. And so the French government then sends another French army to bail them out. And then the Prussians turn around and they encircle that relief army as well, causing basically both armies to surrender in mass. It's a complete and total military debacle. The French emperor, because at this point, and I don't want to get us bogged down into some of the nitty gritty stuff, but by this point, France was basically an empire again. So they went back and forth. So they had a republic. They had overthrown their king. They had a republic. Then they get a king again. So by this point, we have an emperor in France named Napoleon III, who was actually a relative of Napoleon Bonaparte's. So he was calling himself Napoleon III. And Napoleon III was captured in battle. And so there's this famous sketch over here that shows, Bismarck and Napoleon hanging out on the front porch of like some small village house, basically watching the battle as it unfolded. Complete and total lopsided conflict over by early 1871, total decisive German victory. And one of the big things that we see, on the lips of every French soldier leading up until 1914, on the lips of all these French politicians leading up to the events of World War I and the beginnings of it in 1914, was remember Sedan. We need to restore our honor lost at Sedan. So really, it's this loss that paves the way for that much bloodier future conflict. Well, finally, what's so important about the Franco-Prussian War, other than just the fact that, hey, they do end up getting Alsace and Lorraine as part of the terms of this peace agreement, is that it was also at the end of this war and as part of the peace treaty to end it, that unification came full circle. That the southern German states agreed to join the North German Confederation as one country. And in early 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, think about the irony of that, the fact that they're doing this at the ancestral home of the French kings. Kaiser Wilhelm I was crowned Emperor of the German Empire. So that's what this famous scene is here. And of course, big picture, why this is so important is what this does. Much more so than Italy. I mean, Italy, unified, but Italy was still kind of a peripheral player in world affairs. What this does is it totally throws off that five-way balance of power that had been established at the Congress of Vienna. All of a sudden, that balance is totally skewed by the emergence of a really large, powerful, militaristic Germany. And it's going to set off an arms race. It's going to set off heightened tensions that is then going to explode in everybody's face, 45 years later. So that's kind of the full story here of German unification. Again, hopefully that filled in a few cracks kind of left by that brief little article. So if you haven't already, make sure that you take the brief little exit ticket there, and I will then see everybody back in class tomorrow.